They spent the remainder of that day and all of the rest travelling north and west through the grasslands of Callahorn. The weather was warm, dry and pleasant, and the time passed quickly. Dark thunderclouds appeared to the north around the noon of the first day, hanging ominously over the craggy expanse of the Dragon's Teeth, but by sunset they had blown east into the Rab and were gone. The Valeman and the Elven Gill alternated between riding Artak and walking, doubling up when they rode, then both travelling afoot for a time in order to rest the big black. Artak looked fresh, even after several hours of being ridden, but Will was not about to risk tiring the horse. They saw nothing of the demons that they had lost at the Silver River, but the creatures were certainly out there and looking for them. If they were unlucky enough to be found again, Will wanted Artak ready to run. Bereft of any weapons at all, save for a small hunting knife Will carried tucked in his belt, they were forced to eat fruits and vegetables that grew wild on the grassland. Will found the fare ample, if somewhat less than satisfying, but Amberley seemed not to mind at all. If anything, she seemed quite pleased with their meals. She showed the Velman a talent for discovering food where he would not have guessed food existed, pulling from the most unlikely places edible plants and roots that she readily identified and described in quite thorough detail. Will listened attentively and asked questions from time to time, finding this the one topic of conversation she seemed willing to pursue. Initially, he had tried to draw her out on other subjects, but had met with little success. So they talked of plants and roots, and the rest of the time travelled in silence. They slept that first night in a grove of cottonwood, near a small spring that provided them with clean drinking water. By mid-afternoon of the second day, they reached the Myrmidon and began following it north. Up until that point, they had seen no one, but thereafter passed half a dozen travellers, some afoot, some on horseback, one riding in a small wooden cart drawn by oxen. All exchanged with them a word of friendship and a wave before continuing on their way. At sunset they made camp along the Myrmidon, west of the south of the city of Tursus. Finding shelter in a grove of white pine and willow, using a willow branch, a length of twine, and a hook from his clothing, Will fashioned a crude fishing pole. Within half an hour he had landed a pair of striped bass. He was still cleaning the fish by the river's edge when a caravan of wagons swung into view from the south and wound its way down toward the far bank. Gaily painted houses on wheels, with peaked roofs of cedar shingles, hand-carved wooden doors, and windows studded with brass. The wagons flashed brightly in the setting sun. Teams of finely groomed horses pulled the wagons, their traces laced with bits of silver. Several riders kept pace, their graceful forms cloaked in silk, and trailing streamers of colours from their throats and from the bridles of their mounts. In spite of himself, Will stopped what he was doing and watched the strange procession approach the river. Wagon axles groaning, leather harness creaking, voices calling and whistling encouragement almost directly across from where the Valman sat. The caravan swung in a loose circle and lurched to a halt. Men, women, and children climbed from the wagons and began unhitching the teams and setting up camp. Amberley appeared from the trees behind Will and joined him. The Valeman glanced over at her briefly, then followed her gaze back across the river to the gathering on the far bank. "Rovers," he announced thoughtfully. She nodded. "I've seen them before. The elves don't have much use for them." "No one has." He went back to cleaning the fish. "They'll steal anything that isn't nailed down, or if it is, find a way to talk you out of it. They have their own rules, and they don't pay any attention to anyone else's." Amberley touched his arm, and he looked up to watch a tall man, dressed all in black save for a cloak and a sash of forest green, accompany two older women in long multicoloured skirts and blouses as they carried water buckets down to the water's edge. As the woman stooped to fill the buckets, the tall man removed the wide-brimmed hat, and with a flourish bowed low to Will and Amberley, his darkly tanned face flashing a broad smile through a shading of black beard. Will raised one arm and waved back cordially. "I'm just as glad that they're on that side of the river," he muttered to Amberley as they rose to return to their camp. They enjoyed a savoury meal of fish, fruit, vegetables, and spring water, then settled back next to the campfire and gazed out through breaks in the forest to the glimmer of the rover fires as they blazed up from out of the darkness across the river. They were quiet for a time, lost in their own thoughts. Then Will looked over at the elven girl. "How is it that you know so much about growing things? The gardens at your cottage in Havenstead, the roots and plants you found for us during our journey. Did someone teach you all that?" A look of surprise crossed her face. "For being part elf, you certainly don't know very much about us, do you?" Will shrugged. "Not really. The elven blood is all on my father's side, and he died when I was very young. I don't think that my grandfather has ever gone into the Westland. At least he never speaks about it. In any case, I guess I've just never thought that much about being part elf." "It is something that you should have thought about," she said quietly. Her green eyes found his. "We first need to understand who we were before we can understand who we are." The words were spoken not as a criticism of the Valeman, but almost in self-reproach. Will found himself suddenly wishing that he knew more about this girl, that he could find a way to persuade her to confide even a small piece of herself in him, rather than keeping it all so tightly locked away. "Maybe you could help me gain at least a part of that understanding," he offered, after a moment's thought. There was an instant doubt in her eyes, almost as she believed that he was playing some game with her. She hesitated a long time before answering him. "Very well, maybe I can." She squared herself around so that she was seated facing him. "You must first understand that the elven people believe that preservation of the land and all that lives and grows upon it, plant and animal alike, is a moral responsibility. They have always held this belief foremost in their conduct as creatures of the earth. In the old world they devoted the whole of their lives in caring for the woodlands and forests in which they lived, cultivating its various forms of vegetation, sheltering the animals that it harboured. Of course, they had little else to concern them in those days, for they were an isolated and reclusive people. All that has changed now, but they still maintain a belief in their moral responsibility for their world. Every elf is expected to spend a portion of his life giving back to the land something of what he has taken out of it. By that I mean that every elf is expected to devote a part of his life to working with the land, to repairing damage it may have suffered through misuse or neglect, to caring for its animals and other wildlife, to caring for its tree and smaller plants where they need to do so is found. Is that a part of what you are doing here in Havenstead?" She nodded. "In a way. The chosen are exempt from this service. When I ceased to be one of the chosen and no longer felt welcome in my homeland, I decided that I should do service to the land. Most of the work done by the elves is carried out in the Westland because that is the elven homeland. But we believe that the care of the land is not simply an elven responsibility, but the responsibility of all men. To some extent, the dwarves share our concern, but the other races have never been much persuaded. So some of the elves go out from the Westland to other communities, trying to teach the people living there something of their responsibility for the care and preservation of their land. This is what I was trying to do at Havenstead." "And you were working with the children of the village," Will surmised. "Primarily the children, for the children are more receptive to what I teach and have the time to learn. I was taught of the earth when I was a child. It is the elven way. I was more adept than most at translating the lesson into use. One of the reasons, I guess, that I was selected to be a chosen. The skills of the chosen in the preservation and care of the earth and in its life forms are of the highest order. The Outcries has some sense of this. She has this ability." Amberley seemed to catch herself in the middle of a thought she did not wish to express. She stopped abruptly, shrugging. "Anyway, I was very good at teaching the children of Havenstead, and the people of the village were very kind to me. Havenstead was my home. and I did not want to leave. She shifted her gaze abruptly to the fire between them. Will said nothing, leaning forward to add several pieces of stray wood to the flame. After a moment's silence, Amberley looked up at him again. Well, now you know something of the elven feeling for the land. It's a part of your heritage, so you should try to understand it. I think I do understand it, the Velman replied, reflecting, at least in part. I have not been trained in the elven manner, but I have been trained by the Stores as a healer. Their concern for human life is much the same as the elven concern for the land. A healer must do whatever is in his power to do to preserve the lives and health of the men, women, and children whom he treats. This is the commitment I made when I chose to become a healer. The elven girl looked at him curiously. Somehow that makes it seem even stranger that you were persuaded by Eleanor to look after me. You are a healer, dedicated to preserving life. What will you do if you are placed in a situation where, in order to protect me, you must harm others? Perhaps even cause them to die? Will stared at her wordlessly. He had never even considered the possibility that such a thing might happen. Thinking on it now, he experienced an unpleasant feeling of doubt. I don't know what I'll do, he admitted uncomfortably. They were silent for a moment, staring across the fire at each other, unable to break through the awkwardness of the moment. Then Amberley rose abruptly, came over to the Velman and sat next to him, impulsively clasping his hand in her own. Her winsome face looked out at him through the shadow of her hair. That wasn't a fair question to put to you, Williams, but I'm sorry I asked it. You came on this journey because you believed that you might help me. It is wrong of me and to doubt that you would do so. It was a fair question, Will replied firmly. I just don't have an answer to it. Nor should you, she insisted. I, of all people, should know that some decisions cannot be made in advance of the time that will demand them. We cannot always anticipate the way which things will happen, and therefore cannot anticipate what we will do. We must accept that. Again, I am sorry. You might as well ask me what decision I will make if the Elchrist tells me that I am still one of the chosen. Will smiled faintly. Be careful. I am tempted to ask exactly that. She released his hand instantly and rose. Do not. You would not like the answer I would give you. She shook her head sadly. You think my choice in this is a simple one? One that you could make easily? You are wrong. She walked back to the other side of the fire and reached down for her travel cloak, shaking it out upon the ground as she prepared to roll herself in it to sleep. She turned back to him one final time. Believe me, Valman, should our decisions become necessary, yours will be the easier of the two. She lowered her head to the folds of the cloak and was asleep in moments. Will Omsford stared thoughtfully into the fire. Although he could not begin to explain why, he found that he believed her.